It is 1898. A 68-year-old man sits in chains. Around him, the greatest empire in West Africa has just been brought to its knees. The French, the most powerful colonial force on the continent, believed they had finally won. But it had taken them 16 years, thousands of soldiers, and more embarrassment than their generals ever admitted. The man in chains was Samory Touré, and the world almost forgot his name. What if a man built an empire from nothing? No royal bloodline, no foreign funding, no outside support, just a vision, a strategy, and a refusal to stop? What if that same man held off one of the most powerful military forces in the world for nearly 2 decades, using tactics so effective that French generals put them in their own war reports? His name was Samory Touré. And this is not just a story about war. This is a story about what one man and one people can build and what they will endure to protect it. If you are new here, welcome. We tell the stories history tried to bury. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one. Now, let us go back to West Africa. Back to the 1800s. Back to a war the history books barely whispered about. To understand the war, you first have to understand the man. Samory Touré was born around 1830 in a small village in what is today Guinea, West Africa. He was not born into any royal family. He was not a prince or a chief's son. He was the son of a trader, a man of modest standing in a region fractured by rival kingdoms, ethnic rivalries, and the brutal reach of the slave trade. When Samory was a young man, his mother was taken captive during a raid by a neighboring warlord called Sori Ibrahima. Samory did not run. He did not appeal to anyone for help. He walked directly into the enemy camp and offered himself as a slave in exchange for her freedom. The warlord accepted. Samory served, and he watched. Over the next several years, Samory served in different armies, not as a broken man, but as a student of everything around him. He studied how battles were decided. He watched how commanders handled supply lines, troop morale, the terrain. He learned which strategies held ground and which ones fell apart under pressure. By the time he was in his late 20s, Samory Touré had developed a military mind that no one around him fully understood yet. In the 1860s, he began his campaign to unite the Mandinka people, scattered across what is now Guinea, Sierra Leone, Mali, and Ivory Coast. He did it through alliances, through strategic marriages, through diplomacy, and yes, through military force. By the 1870s, Samory had accomplished what had not been done in living memory. He had built a new empire, the Wassoulou Empire, and stood at its head as its supreme military and political leader. A man who started with nothing had built a state. The Wassoulou Empire was not simply a cluster of loyal villages under a powerful man, it was a functioning state, with a military structure, a justice system, a trade economy, and something that would prove absolutely critical in the wars to come, its own weapons manufacturing industry. Samory organized his forces into a professional military called the Sofas, trained, disciplined infantry fighters who were structured into clear units with clear chains of command. At the empire's peak, he commanded tens of thousands of these soldiers. But what made them dangerous was not just their numbers, it was how they operated. Samory divided his forces into a standing army, always combat ready, and a rotating reserve force, resting, resupplying, training. When the French thought they had identified and cornered his full military strength, they were routinely discovering they had only engaged half of it. But the weapons program is what stands out most to historians. Samory established blacksmith workshops across his territory, specifically to reverse engineer European firearms. His craftsmen studied captured French and British rifles and reproduced them with remarkable accuracy. By the mid-1880s, his army was equipped not only with traditional weapons, but with functional modern repeating rifles, manufactured by his own people, on his own land. Samory had one strict rule for this program. His army would never become dependent on European weapons suppliers. He had watched too many African leaders lose leverage the moment a European trader decided to cut off their supply. His weapons came from his own empire. His military logistics answered to no one outside his borders. He was, in the most practical sense, building for independence. In 1884, the major European powers gathered in Berlin and divided the entire continent of Africa among themselves. No African leader was present at that conference. No African voice was consulted. France claimed a vast territory across West Africa and immediately began pushing its military presence inland, building forts, establishing trade control, and moving south. The officer leading France's military expansion in the region was Colonel Gustave Bourgnes de Borde. He was experienced and aggressive. The French had superior firepower, organized logistics, and the full backing of the French government and military. They had swept through every African kingdom that stood in their path. Then, they reached the Wassoulou Empire. The first serious military confrontation came in 1882, near the town of Kenyuran. The French expected a brief, decisive engagement, the kind they had become accustomed to across the continent. What they encountered instead was something they had not prepared for. Samory's sofas did not mass and charge. They moved in coordinated, fluid waves. They used the landscape. They absorbed pressure and counterattacked from unexpected angles. They retreated in order, not in panic, and hit back harder at the moment the French thought the battle was finished. The French won several early engagements but could never land the finishing blow. Every time they advanced, Samory's forces dissolved into the terrain and reappeared somewhere else. Colonel Bourgnes de Borde sent dispatches back to Paris that acknowledged, in the careful language of a professional soldier who did not want to admit he was struggling, that this adversary was unlike anything his forces had faced on the continent. Samory Touré was fighting a tactically modern war with a tactically modern mind. After 4 years of inconclusive and expensive fighting, both sides paused. In 1886, Samory Touré and French representatives signed a formal treaty. The agreement drew a boundary line along the Niger River, French territory to the north, the Wassoulou Empire to the south. On paper, it was a negotiated recognition of Samory's state. In practice, it was a lie. French military planners had no intention of honoring the treaty beyond the time it took them to regroup. This was not conspiracy. It was documented. French officers wrote to Paris during the peace period, explicitly discussing the next military campaign against Samory. The treaty was a tactical pause, not a political settlement. Samory understood this completely. He had spent years watching European powers negotiate with African kings and then discard those agreements the moment circumstances changed. So, he used the peace years with full urgency. He expanded his rifle manufacturing workshops. He extended his trade networks eastward. He made direct diplomatic contact with the British in Sierra Leone, attempting, with sophisticated geopolitical instinct, to use British interest in the region as a counterweight against French expansion. The British ultimately declined to intervene, but the attempt itself speaks to how clearly Samory read the international situation around him. The peace ended in 1891. France appointed a new commander, Colonel Louis Archinard, whose mandate was simple: finish the job. Archinard launched a full military invasion of the Wassoulou Empire, with a force larger than anything the French had previously deployed in the region. He was not interested in negotiation. He wanted Samory's empire erased from the map of West Africa. The second phase of the war had begun, and it would be unlike anything that came before. When France launched its full invasion in 1891, their strategy was straightforward: encircle the Wassoulou Empire, destroy its capital, cut its supply lines, and force a surrender. It was the same strategy that had ended African resistance everywhere else they had applied it. Samory Touré's response was something military historians still study today. He moved his entire empire. He ordered his people, the full civilian population under his authority, to abandon their villages, destroy everything that could not be carried, and march east toward what is now Ivory Coast and Ghana. He would not give the French a fixed capital to capture. He would not allow them to seize his infrastructure and declare the war over. If survival required movement, the empire would move. If it required burning what he had built, he would burn it himself before the French could use it. This is the scorched earth doctrine, a military concept recorded in European warfare as early as the Scythians and used famously by Russia against Napoleon in 1812. Samory applied it across thousands of miles of West African terrain, with a moving population and a fighting army simultaneously for 7 years. From 1891 to 1898, his sofas conducted a sustained guerrilla war across terrain the French had no reliable maps for. They ambushed supply columns. They hit French patrols at night and vanished before morning. They crossed rivers and highland ridges, absorbed losses, resupplied from captured French equipment, and kept fighting. The French, the premier colonial military force in West Africa, could not pin down a man who had decided that the battlefield itself was negotiable. In Paris, the embarrassment was real. Military reports described a campaign against what they called a single warlord, stretching into its 8th, 9th, 10th year. Troops and resources that France needed elsewhere were tied down in an unresolved conflict that had begun to affect France's credibility across the continent. But the war's human cost must be stated honestly. The scorched earth migration displaced hundreds of thousands of civilians, Samory's own people. They marched through disease, hunger, and exposure. Entire communities were uprooted. Villages were burned not by the French, but by Samory's own order to deny the enemy any advantage. Historians have written critically about this dimension of his campaign, and those criticisms carry weight. The people who suffered most during his resistance were often the very people he was fighting to protect. That contradiction is part of his story, and it does not disappear. By the autumn of 1898, Samory Touré was 68 years old. He had been at war with France for 16 years. His empire had shifted more than 1,000 miles east from where it had begun. His army was depleted. His people were exhausted. And France had finally coordinated enough forces from enough directions to close the net. On September 29, 1898, a French column led by Lieutenant Henri Gouraud, a young officer who had been tracking Samory specifically for months, located his camp near the village of Guélémou in what is now Ivory Coast. The exact circumstances of the capture remain disputed in the historical record. Some accounts indicate Samory was betrayed by someone in his immediate circle. Other accounts describe his guards being asleep. What the French military records confirm is that Samory was taken without a battle. There was no final charge, no last stand. When French soldiers entered his tent and put him in chains, there was only a tired man at the end of a 16-year war. The same man who had walked into an enemy camp as a young man to free his mother now sat in French captivity for the first time in his life. Gouraud, in his own written account, described the capture of Samory Touré as more significant than any military victory he had ever achieved. He understood, as did every French officer who had spent years chasing this man, what Samory represented. Not simply a military opponent, a demonstration. Proof repeated over 16 years that an African empire could be organized, armed, and sustained against the full weight of European colonial force. That idea had survived every battle the French had won. The French exiled Samory to Gabon, as far from his homeland as the continent allowed. He died there in June 1900, less than 2 years after his capture. He never returned home. He was never freed. His empire, officially dissolved, was absorbed into French West Africa. The French did their best to write Samory Touré out of the history they controlled. Colonial-era textbooks described him as a brutal warlord who had terrorized his own people and prolonged a war that was always going to end one way. The focus was consistently on the darkest corners of his legacy, the forced migrations, the burned villages, while the full picture of what he had built and how long he had held it was minimized. It was more useful to dismiss him than to explain why 16 years of the French army's best effort had not been enough to defeat him. But in West Africa, people remembered. Oral traditions, family histories, the griots who carried knowledge across generations. The story of Samory Touré was never lost among the people who lived it. It traveled without textbooks. Then, in September 1958, something happened that connected directly to that legacy. A man named Sékou Touré, Samory's grandson, stood before Charles de Gaulle and the French government. France had offered its African territories a form of limited self-governance within a French community, an arrangement that preserved significant French control over the territory's economies, foreign policy, and military. Every other French territory in Africa accepted the arrangement. Sékou Touré refused. He demanded complete, unconditional, immediate independence. De Gaulle did not hide his response. France withdrew everything: financial support, technical staff, infrastructure personnel. French officials reportedly ripped telephone wires from the walls of government buildings before they left. Paris expected Guinea to collapse within months, humiliated and forced to come back asking for terms. Instead, Guinea became the first sub-Saharan African territory to achieve full independence in the modern era on October 2, 1958. The precedent it set reverberated across the continent. Within 2 years, 17 other African nations had declared independence. The grandson had, in the arena of diplomacy, finished what the grandfather had begun in the arena of war. Today, Samory Touré is recognized across West Africa as one of the most significant military and political leaders the continent produced in the 19th century. His tactics have been studied at military institutions, including, notably, in France itself, the country whose army he kept at bay for 16 years. Streets and schools carry his name in Guinea. His story is taught to students as a factual record of organized African resistance. Statues stand where his empire once moved. He is not a myth. He is not a symbol invented for political convenience. He was a man born without privilege who built a state, armed it without foreign help, and refused, for 16 extraordinary years, to let it fall. Samory Touré did not just fight a war. He built an empire from nothing. He armed it with weapons his own craftsmen manufactured. He moved it across a continent rather than surrender it. And he held off the most powerful colonial military force in West Africa for 16 consecutive years, longer than almost any other resistance leader in recorded African history. His story is not simple. The forced displacement of his own people, the scorched earth decisions made under the weight of an unwinnable position. These are real parts of his record, and history does not erase them. But what also cannot be erased is this. When every other empire around him fell, Samory Touré refused. He bent the limits of what was possible, and when the French finally put him in chains, they could not chain what his resistance had already put into motion. His grandson stood before the most powerful nation in West Africa's colonial history and said no, clearly, completely, without conditions. And the continent heard it. That idea, that a people, organized and determined, can resist anything, outlived Samory Touré. It always does. If this story moved you, share it. Someone needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and when you are ready, the next video is right there. I will see you in it.